Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's wrong with science and what you can do to protect yourself against bad science. We're going to talk a little bit about epidemiological studies, biased research, biased funding, and also scientific evolution. So what is an epidemiological study? Essentially, it's a survey dished out to thousands of people created by scientists. Scientists will make a survey that says, how many fresh fruits and vegetables do you take in? What are your cancer rates? And then the scientists will get that information back from the thousands of people that they surveyed, and compile it, and then develop correlations and say, okay, people who consume this many fresh fruits and vegetables have lower rates of cancer. So that sort of correlation can be used to develop a hypothesis, and sometimes used to back up research, or back up sort of what their thinking is, which is really not the best idea, and I'll tell you why here. So let's say the dairy industry wants to do something similar. They want to see if, people who consume 1%, 2%, or whole milk have low rates of cancer. So they conclude that people who consume 1% milk have low rates of cancer. Therefore, go ahead and consume 1% milk. We reduce our rates of cancer than people who don't consume 1% milk or otherwise. So, but really, what if it's not the 1% milk that's doing it, but it's the fact that people who consume 1% milk actually have a more health-conscious mind, and they consume more fresh fruits and vegetables? Then a scientist will look at that and say it's the milk, and the other scientist will say, well, it's the fruits and vegetables. There's things you can do to sort of control these factors, like making sure that they consume that amount of milk and that they don't consume any fresh fruits and vegetables, or a limited quantity of fresh fruits and vegetables. And therefore you can sort of make a better conclusion. But that's what's called clinical trials. In clinical trials, I mean, if you think about it, to try and feed all those people or watch all those people, it's pretty expensive. And, to do that with any significant time frame, you have to do that for, at least like 3 months to, 5 years. And do that for that extended amount of time, obviously you can see why it can get really expensive. So that's why epidemiological studies are generally one of the most widespread in the scientific community, but also some of the weakest. Obviously, the cheapest thing is the weakest evidence, of course. So really, and the reason why, again, like I talked about, is inability to control variables, and that's really where the biggest issue is. Now let's talk about biased scientists. So a biased scientist will take a look at either study and say, okay, well, obviously you had reduced rates of cancer, but you didn't look at how much milk they consumed. And this scientist will say, well, you didn't look at how many fresh fruits and vegetables they consumed, or you didn't control for it. And so either scientists can sort of butt heads and refute one another's evidence. And so therefore, and you'll see that a lot with dietary science lectures. A lot of people will begin a statement by saying, well, this person used this scientist and it didn't control, or this science, they didn't control for how much grains they ate in a day. And this scientist will say, oh, they didn't control for how much meat they consumed in a day. And therefore, they're refuting each other's evidence based on the idea of inability to control variables. And then they go ahead and back up their own evidence with these epidemiological studies. And it's kind of like, well, it's ridiculous, because then someone's just going to come in and refute each other's evidence. So, epidemiological studies are really great for developing hypotheses, ideas, but they should never really be used to support a thought, really. Just sort of set the idea of a thought, and then use clinical trials which are rarer and harder to find, especially towards your specific idea. But you need to use clinical trials in order to really support your evidence. So now let's talk a little bit about biased funding. So let's say that Monsanto wants to go ahead and take a look at whether or not GMO corn gives you higher rates of cancer in mice than non-GMO corn. And all of a sudden they find that 25% of there's a 25% increase in cancer rates in the GMO corn. Well, Monsanto can go ahead and say, well, I don't really feel like publishing the study. It's going to cost me money. I'm not going to go ahead and do it. And, a scientist can say, well, no, I want to publish the study. But what they have already done was, because generally I would assume that scientists are maybe a little bit more moral than, people with financial ties. So a scientist may want to publish that study, but generally what's already been done is they've already signed a contract saying any evidence that I produce is property of Monsanto, and any evidence and anything I can't discuss or disclose anything I have here I have found in my findings in the study. And that's what's kind of sort of messed up, is that all the evidence that's out there, necessarily on PubMed or the Journal of Medicine, may not necessarily be the full truth. And that's because of the fact that people can choose what they really want to publish. There's no real law saying that you have to publish evidence that you don't necessarily want to, because it costs money, and they can't really make you, spend money. The government can't really make you spend money just because you're doing it. But on that note, you can't necessarily refute everything that Monsanto may come out with. If they came out with the fact that the GMO corn and regular corn are not any more carcinogenic than each other, then you have to sort of take that with an understanding that maybe that could be true. You have to make sure, though, that you look at the results, how much they were fed of each one, and things like the duration of the trial. If that was only 2 weeks and you saw no difference in cancer rates, well, that's kind of ridiculous, right? Of course, cancer takes a while to develop. We're not saying that GMO corn will instantly make you get cancer. We're saying that maybe generally the thought is that over the entire lifespan of an individual, that they could develop cancer rates if they consume in sufficient quantities of GMO corn, because of insecticides or otherwise. So make sure you take a look at the results and methods done, because otherwise you're going to put yourself in jeopardy of just either saying, oh, this evidence is ridiculous, and shunt any sort of significant findings that they could be the same, and just say, well, and have your own sort of biased thought. And you're going to end up just like all these other biased scientists, and you're not really going to have any forward thinking. But by taking a look at the results and the methods, you're going to be able to conclude and intelligently whether or not they did the study correctly, and therefore be able to be like, haha, well, you screwed this up, and my thought is still correct because you've messed up this part of the clinical trial. And so now let's talk a little bit. So that was bias funding. So let's talk about slow development thinking. Really, what this comes down to is the fact that you're also a scientist, and I'll tell you what I mean. Let's say you notice that 8 of your friends or whatever, whenever they go to McDonald's or something, that they eat a burger and they're fine. But if they eat a burger and they drink a soda, that all of a sudden every one of them has diarrhea. But there's no scientific evidence backing up that McDonald's burger and soda equals diarrhea. But you'd be a fool to say that, oh, well, it doesn't. There's no scientific evidence, so therefore there's no linkage. And that's kind of ridiculous. That's like saying that because there was no evidence supporting, I mean, at one point, no scientific, paper stating that exercise is, good for your health. We said that, well, the government couldn't say anything that exercise was good for your health because there was no scientific paper published, and that we should just go about our day just as we always did, and they couldn't really support anything. And that's kind of, like I said, it's kind of ridiculous. You need to make sure that you take your daily life opinion and observations into account whenever you're doing anything. But just like I said before, not without any variables. You need to account for all the other variables. Maybe that when they consume the burger and the soda, that they all have diarrhea. But maybe they always get diarrhea anyways. And when you consume a burger and a soda, you don't get diarrhea. But because of maybe some genetic factor or maybe something else that they're eating in the day all together because they all hang out and they're all friends, that's what's actually causing the diarrhea and not exactly what you observe immediately. So that's what I'm really trying to say is like, you're your own scientist, and you need to make sure that you can conclude and with validity and strength what's going on. And don't just say, well, this is the cause and that's the cause. Try and do what you can. I know the day is really busy, but try and do what you can to, and it'll be really beneficial if you do, to sort of develop a scientific thinking, and that'll allow yourself to really, discern whether or not these things on the news are truthful. Whether or not if that high fructose corn syrup is any different than sugar, and look into that and make sure that you do some research, and because the news is really sensational, and that's the other thing, is that they always try and pull a whole all on one side. They try to do anything to get viewers come in, and that's sensational news. Just like when you, back in 8th grade, when you went to write a paper, what did you do to write a paper? You wrote a persuasive paper. You wrote all on one side. You never took, sort of both sides and said, well, this is the benefits of this side and this is the benefits of that side. You always took one side and wrote all the good about it, and the other side wrote all the bad about it. And that's what really made a good persuasive paper. But that's what we have to sort of stray away from in dietary science. We have to sort of get away from this binary idea that one thing is good and one thing is bad, and go back to the idea that there's moderation that needs to be done in all of diet and our diets in general, and that maybe consuming all one thing could eventually end up being bad for us. I know from personal experience, I ate a crap ton of salad, and I ended up pooping green. And that was not necessarily the best thing I've ever had happen to me.